Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. After all the drama that came with the 2020 election, will it become harder or easier to vote in the United States? Let's get to the bottom line. One of the biggest political battles this year will be over voting and elections. Millions of Americans, led by former President Donald Trump, still don't believe in the results of the last election. They call it stolen. So ironically, instead of celebrating the record-breaking number of Americans who voted in November for both Republicans and Democrats, this too is dividing the country. Today, we have new proposals for laws in 33 states to restrict how people register and how they vote, mostly coming from Republican politicians. In the U.S. Senate, the Democrats are pushing a bill that would widely increase registered voters and make voting easier. Republicans say the Democratic proposals would lead to chaos and to fraud. Democrats say the Republican restrictions amount to voter suppression, especially among the disadvantaged. So the country is torn in two opposite directions. But which way will it go? To figure this out, we're joined by Sadiqa Reynolds, the CEO of the Urban League in Louisville, Kentucky. The Urban League is America's oldest movement focused on empowering African Americans. And John Fund, a columnist with the National Review and author of the book Stealing Elections: How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy. Thank you both for joining me today. John, let me start with you. You've written a very compelling, very powerful piece called H.R. 1 Must Be Stopped, which is the voting rights legislation that Nancy Pelosi has had successfully passed in the House and has gone over to the Senate. I guess my question to you would be, what is your concern about that? After we had so many voters turn out in the last election, what are the primary concerns you have about codifying that and further expanding voter access?
Well, we have a divided country when it comes to the legitimacy of elections. You pointed out that about a third of Donald Trump's supporters believe the election wasn't legitimate or counted fairly. But a poll by Scott Rasmussen taken just last month found that a third of Democrats still believe that the 2016 election was either stolen or the votes were not counted fairly, citing everything from Russian interference to computer voting machine scandals. And I'll remind you that Democrats in the House of Representatives objected to the results in 7 states, certifying those results. So both sides have an enormous number of people who have basic questions about the fairness of our system. 2/3 of Americans. So what do you have? What do you do when you have such a divided country? You have bipartisan legislation. In 2002, we had the Help America Vote Act. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation passed by a Republican Congress and signed by President Bush. Chris Dodd, the Democratic sponsor, said, this bill does what every election bill should do. At the same time, it makes it easier to vote and it makes it harder to cheat. We're Americans. We can do both at the same time. In contrast to that, when H.R. 1 passed in the House of Representatives, not a single Republican voted for it, not one. So you have to ask yourself, how long-lasting would these changes be until the next party upheaval that brought in a Republican majority, perhaps only that long? And how much credibility would they have with the 2 voters who already think that the system is rigged against their own beliefs? So we need bipartisan support. We don't need a one-size-fits-all federal takeover of elections, which has zero bipartisan support.
So, John, let me just follow up on one point here, which is, what is the Republican agenda today? Because you're referencing a piece of legislation. I admit it would be great if it were bipartisan, but decades ago, what is the forward-leaning Republican legislation on voter scaffolding and voter expansion and how to make this process easier and, frankly, modern? I mean, it's remarkable how unmodern the voting system is in some places in this country.
Well, we don't spend nearly enough on our election infrastructure as we should. The reason why you sometimes take money from your ATM machine at the bank and you don't always count every bill is because you trust that machine. But that machine costs about 8 times more than the government electronic voting machine that most states use. So I'm not going to go get into the fact of whether or not the election results on computer terminals are accurate. I think they are. But the real problem is we don't invest as much in our election infrastructure. We don't increase the confidence level to the point that we should. As for expanding voting, I think early voting is far superior to absentee or all mail-in voting. It's conducted under the supervision of government employees. It's still a secret ballot, which mail-in voting is not. And I would much prefer that be expanded. And I also would consider perhaps we should, as the former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young, said, and perhaps we should change our national election day. Maybe it should be on a Sunday. Maybe it should be having Tuesday declared a national holiday. All of these things are possible, but they're not possible if you have a one-size-fits-all takeover of things like the Federal Election Commission, which has always been divided equally between the parties. But in H.R. 1, one party would have a majority and would be able to ram through any changes that it wishes, including changes that have clear partisan advantages to it.
Sadiq, well, one of the things we've seen in places like Louisville, Kentucky, but throughout America, is an uptick in voter participation, in voter engagement. And this has happened during a time of national crisis, given the pandemic, when I think literally the first time in my life everything has gone digital. I think we've moved from the analog world to the digital world, but particularly the African-American community as well. And I'd just be interested to get your dashboard, your sense of this Voting Rights Act, and what dimensions of it are most important to you, and maybe any thoughts you have in response to some of the things that John has shared.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. And I appreciate, let me start with the things that John and I agree on. I think that early voting is very important. It is really fundamental, and it's something that we should see expanded. To the extent that we have things that were improved because of the pandemic, to the extent that we were able to rely on technology and early voting and those things that really allowed people to engage more freely in the process, I think those are things that we need to focus on and enhance. It is wrong, though, to not talk about the bills and the things that have been introduced across this country by Republicans that really do lead to less voter access. I think we cannot avoid this conversation. And while I do appreciate the need for bipartisan legislation, and I certainly hope that someday we can get to that point, the reality is there's just no evidence that we are going to get there now in this country, in this climate. And I think that's important for us to really have a conversation about. It seems to me, and I heard, the information that was shared earlier around how Democrats might feel about a 2016 election, how people feel about a 2020 election. But at the end of the day, what we feel is not the point. The issue is, what can you prove? And there is no overwhelming evidence that voter fraud exist in any way, shape, or form that is something that we need to address in the way that Republicans talk about it. It's just not as extensive. I'm not saying that there isn't some of that. Sure, there's fraud in everything. But is there an overwhelming mountain of evidence that says we have to do something? The answer to that is no. But what we do have evidence of is voter suppression. And when you look at these bills that have been introduced, when you look across the country and you see the things that are being put on Black and brown communities, you understand that the issue here really is about reducing voter access. There are people in this country that don't want to see Black and brown people participate. They just don't. They want a certain group of people to be able to control the outcomes. And that's what we cannot have. We cannot have it any longer. So while, again, I certainly wish that we could have bipartisan legislation, I certainly wish that we could come to some agreement, I just don't think that that can happen right now. So the answer is, in my view, to do whatever it takes to ensure that the greatest number of people can participate in this democracy, because that is the only way to actually secure the democracy.
Sadiqa, what are some of the steps that can be taken so that we can get a high trust voting environment as opposed to one where people are really skeptical?
Well, I mean, first of all, I do think that we need early voting so that you have people actually able to participate. I do think that absentee ballots work in many places. We should have no excuse. I mean, we should do that. I think that you have to have elected officials who actually respect the outcomes. So if you look at what happened in this 2020 election, you have a president who is claiming that the election was stolen. But you look across the country and there were Republicans who won all over the place. And in fact, there were Republicans who were actually in charge of the election. But the party that really won the majority of the vote in many, many cases was claiming that they lost and that the election was stolen. So I think there is a lot of responsibility to be placed on the elected officials who get on television and use the media to say things that they know just flat out are not true. I mean, that leads to a lack of trust. And that happens quite often. And we've got to talk about that. We've got to begin to address that. I think there have to be consequences for that. And I think we really need to point out, again, you have a president who lost the election and other people in that party who won across the board. And still they were willing to say that somehow every election was stolen but theirs. It just doesn't make sense. And so we do not get to suspend our common sense when we're talking about election fraud, but we can look at how we are engaging in suppression. I mean, if you think about even who gets to run, why would people be upset around a match if you're able to raise money and then there is a matching component to that, so that you have more people who are, regular folks who are able to engage in the process? What is wrong with that? Why do we want the wealthiest people in this country to continue to be able to run or continue to be able to fund these elections and then control the outcomes?
Right.
Why wouldn't you want a woman to be able to pay for childcare if she's raised money, but you'll let a man pay for a tuxedo? Those are things that don't make sense to me. They don't make sense to anyone because they're not fair. We still have more than 75% of our congressional representation. They're white. More than 74% are men. So I think what Republicans fear is not voter fraud. They fear voter access. They fear voter voice. They fear a real system that includes everyone, where everybody gets to speak and we get to decide who represents us and how they represent us and how long they represent us, because some of these folks need to be sent home.
Right.
That's Democrats and Republicans. So we need voter reform, and it is absolutely necessary for us to ensure that this country really becomes as great as I know this country can be.
Right. John, I'm not asking you to represent President Trump, but I think President Trump was asking for states not to be able to conduct elections the way they were.
And he failed completely. So the system worked. Look, states 34 states have voter ID laws of some form or another. The National Bureau of Economic Research looked at 10 years of data, and they concluded that voter ID laws, quote, have no negative effect on registration or turnout overall or for any group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. I do not believe there is this mountain of evidence that there's voter suppression out there. I believe we should take every reasonable step possible to ensure access to the polls. We fought a great civil rights struggle in the 1960s over that. We need to preserve and extend those gains. But on voter ID laws, there is no evidence that they lead to lower turnout. In every election, minority turnout goes up, not down, despite the existence of these voter ID laws. What H.R. 1 would do is basically tell the states, you can't have voter ID laws. You may have them on the books, but if somebody wants to go in and simply say, I am who I say I am, they're going to be allowed to vote, nullifying the basic law. You're getting rid of 34 individual, may I finish, please?
Yes.
You're getting rid of 34 individual states and their laws and the debate that took place in those states in which there was a reason for putting in those laws. As for whether or not candidates want to deny whether or not they lost or not, what President Trump did was completely deplorable. I think what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, she still hasn't conceded the race for governor of Georgia. And I'd like to ask you, do you believe that Stacey Abrams should concede the race finally after 3 years and say, look, I lost the race for governor of Georgia? This happens in both political parties, and you can't put it on one political party.
I certainly don't so there is no perfection in either of these parties, unfortunately.
So should Stacey Abrams finally concede? Yes or no?
Now, are you going to let me finish?
Let's just answer yes or no.
No, you don't get to tell me what to answer when. You just wait 1 second and allow me to finish.
So you won't answer?
What I'm going to do is answer when I'm ready. But what I want to do first is say this. We are still in the fight for a perfect union in America. And you are correct that there are flaws with both of these parties. That being said, I don't think her concession at this point matters one way or the other. The issue is that we do have to ensure that people have access to vote. We have to make sure that people who are alive and well and intending to vote are not purged from election rolls. And that is what happened in Georgia. And you understand that. And so did President Trump. The arguments are very different, the two. But I want to talk about voter access. And I think this is important. When you talk about ID laws, for example, let's look at Texas. The legislation there, they are proposing that, no, that's not wrong. That's not right. They actually have this in Texas. If you have a gun license, you can vote with your gun license ID, but a student ID doesn't work. Why does that matter? Because 80% of gun holders in Texas are white, and 50% of the students are people of color. So I want you to understand that we understand what is being done here. And it doesn't always say this is about Black people and brown people, but we understand the impact. So if we are really going to have bipartisan legislation or even a bipartisan conversation, well, let's start with the truth. Let's start with the truth of the unintended and the intended consequences. I am happy to have these discussions. I think they are the right thing to do for this country that I love so much. And it seems to me that you love. So if that is the case, let us find some common ground. But let's not start with dishonesty.
John, would you be interested in...
Let me just finish.
Yeah,
she asked me a question regarding student ID and gun licenses.
I didn't ask you a question. I did not ask you a question.
Well, you raised the issue, and I would like to answer it.
That's fine.
Again, I'd like to answer it. I talked to Congressman Henry Cuellar, who's the Democrat who represents Laredo, Texas, in the House of Representatives. And he had a perfect explanation for why this is the case. A gun license, you have to show ID, a photo ID, to get the gun license. So that process has already been taken care of. A student ID does not require you to show any kind of ID other than the fact that you're a student at the university, which means that if you're undocumented, and you have absolutely no right to vote as a non-citizen, you can still get a student ID. So allowing someone who has a student ID to vote would basically be saying, if you're undocumented, all you have to do is get a student ID to vote, and there'll be no questions asked, which is a complete workaround of the voter ID law that's in place in Texas. So you're comparing apples with oranges, and that is the answer from a Democratic congressman to me.
And again, it doesn't matter to me if it's a Democratic congressman or a Republican congressman. The issue should be a nonpartisan one. If we want to really talk about policy change and we really care about voter access and who is allowed to have a voice in this country, we shouldn't be speaking as Republicans or Democrats. We should simply be speaking as Americans. And what I am saying is there is no evidence that there's overwhelming voter fraud by people who are not registered to vote in this country. You just don't have the evidence. We have anecdotal information. That is all. And so you don't know, and no one will talk about whether or not anyone's using a fake ID to get a gun license. You think that doesn't happen? But yet we're still ready to assume that every gun license holder is qualified to be a voter. Why? Because of race and racism. That is just the truth at the base of this argument, and we have to talk about that. And if nothing else has exposed the damage that racism has done in this country, surely to God it is this pandemic and all of the separations and the way that it has impacted our country and my community. So let's have some real conversations around that.
John, do you look at gerrymandering as a problem in the United States? How would you approach that? Do you look at a problem that transparency is bad for democracy? Just interested in how you would deal with those dimensions of that bill.
Well, again, the Constitution gives the primary role in conducting the time, manner, and place of elections to the states. And many states have disclosure laws. Many states have campaign finance restrictions. Many states have transparency laws. And some are models for the rest of the country, and some are adapted to local conditions. I would simply say, again, a one-size-fits-all doesn't make any sense. Parts of H.R. 1 would make it illegal to question the validity of the voter registration rolls, because that would be viewed as a form of voter suppression. But the Pew Research Center very recently came out with a study that said 1 out of 6 voter registrations in the country are outdated, inaccurate, or false. And The problem with H.R. 1 is it would mandate that every state take every government record, whether it's an unemployment record, whether it's a driver's registration record, and they would have to register automatically everyone on that list, including duplications, which would make the current sloppy state of our voter registrations even worse. And many state secretaries of state, including Democrats, are appalled that this power would be taken away from them.
And your views on gerrymandering?
Well, I wrote the very first articles on gerrymandering because I experienced it as a staff member in the California State Legislature in the 1980s. I opposed it when Republicans were doing it. I opposed it when Democrats were doing it. Gerrymandering probably should be handled by a commission. My favorite version is Iowa's, where a computer draws the lines and it doesn't even take into account where incumbents live. But that's a state decision, and the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled on that. I do not believe that the gerrymandering provision of H.R. 1 would pass muster with the latest Supreme Court decision on gerrymandering, so it's an exercise in bloviation. It's not going to go anywhere, and it's providing false hope for gerrymandering reform. Gerrymandering reform has to come at the state level, and I encourage it.
Sadiqa, when it comes to Kentucky and your constituents that you're dealing with, I don't know the Kentucky scene well. Is that something where some of these other provisions on transparency of political donations, which you were just talking about for the small donor, but also for the large donors, and these provisions about gerrymandering reform, as John just talked about, would those make a difference in your political climate?
Oh, of course, those would make a difference everywhere. And I think that's why it's important for us to have political consistency. And that's why it's so important for the federal government to be engaged there. I mean, at the end of the day, we all agree gerrymandering is really about limiting people's access and their ability to be represented. And so to the extent that we can have lines drawn in a neutral way, that is exactly what we need. So again, my friend and I here may have found another place where we actually can agree. I think it should not matter where the elected official lives or who is in that district. I mean, to date, that has been really focused on race and controlling political outcomes. But if it really is, if we're drawing lines really just about the numbers and what makes sense, I think that would be great across the country. But I cannot imagine that states could be trusted to do that individually, independently. I think we do need the federal government, and H.R. 1 matters, and it should pass.
Just real quickly, John, I've been intrigued. I know the differences between the two of you. I've been fascinated to listen to the similarities that are there. Neither of you are elected to this role, but if I were to get you together to solve this problem, could you draft something and say, hey, here are the areas, the equities that America should be concerned about, and there is opportunity for a bipartisan agreement. Do you agree with that, John?
Oh, yes, and I think a lot of the people pushing H.R. 1 have not fully consulted the groups that they have, shall we say, decided to speak for. For example, on voter ID laws, and none of the points I made on voter ID laws were challenged, including the fact that turnout continues to go up as long as these voter ID laws continue to be passed. Every single survey without exception, including one taken last month, show a majority of African Americans support voter ID laws. A majority of Hispanics support voter ID laws. A majority of Asian Americans support voter ID laws. So I think the first area of common agreement might be, let's actually consult real people and real voters what their priorities are. And rather than have special interest groups, whether it's on the right or left, come up with their lists. Let's have a much broader debate, and let's have it at the state level rather than stuff everything into a bill that's 900 pages long, that is passed without a single bipartisan shred of support and rushed through in the matter of weeks without even hearings. There are no hearings on this bill.
Well, the bill is a good bill, and the voter to tie increase voter participation to the creation of voter ID laws is ridiculous, and I just didn't think I needed to address it. But now that I have, there it is.
Well, we're going to have to leave this one there. We're going to have to leave this one there.
34 states have it.
Yeah.
And they may have it, but that's not why people showed up to vote. They showed up because they were more engaged this time than ever.
There is no mountain of evidence that leads to voter
how much they had to lose because of this former president. Come on, that was not
there. We had it. I thought I had you all overlapping, but clearly not the case. I want to thank Sadiqa Reynolds, CEO of the Urban League in Louisville, Kentucky, and John Fund, columnist with the National Review Online. Thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? Why can't there be a bipartisan effort that keeps American elections easily accessible and secure at the same time? Wouldn't both sides like to take credit for upgrading and modernizing the way Americans vote? Online registration, is that such an impossible task in the 21st century? And wouldn't that be the appropriate way to celebrate the historic turnout of 2020 when a record number of Americans voted and mail-in voting worked without widespread fraud, without virtually no fraud? Of course not. Instead, the parties today are going to spend their time accusing each other of trying to undermine democracy. The country will still be pulled in opposite directions, with some states expanding voting rights and others restricting them. Somehow, these United States keep feeling more and more divided. And that's the bottom line.